Okay, here we go, friends. We are now live. Welcome, everyone, to Highlands to Islands. This week, we are very excited because we're going to be talking about a whiskey concept that can serve to confuse and befuddle, like most whiskey concepts can, but one that is at the very heart of what we do both at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, and one that feeds into the broader narrative of the Moet Hennessy family. So today we are honored to be joined by our friend and colleague, senior brand manager, or senior education manager for Moet Hennessy, our friend Rich Buchanan at Heavy Robot on Instagram. Rich, thank you for joining us on the show. We're really happy that you had the time to join us,
Mr. Dan, Mr. Cameron. It's a pleasure. I will tweak my username at Instagram. It's Happy Robot USA.
Oh yes, that's right.
Which
the USA
was,
part. Sorry, I forgot about that.
Yes, I got into some sort of spat with someone in Korea, so I had to take the USA. And
right on.
And it was a really funny name back in 2004.
It's still funny. There's still a funniness about it. I still get a good chuckle out of it. A thing that occurred to me the other day, I was watching, this is fully off topic, and it was a thing I meant to mention to you in private, but here we are. There's a character on so this is the end, close to the end of season 2 of Rick and Morty. There's an episode called Intergalactic Cable, part 2. And the guy that's the host of the Personal Space Show, that's your voice. You're the host of the Personal Space Show on Intergalactic Cable. So congratulations to you for that. That's terrific.
You know, it's tough. It's tough doing voiceover and my normal job. It's a lot of work.
Well, yeah, certainly. You got a lot of irons in the fire. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So part of the reason that we totally dig hanging out with you, but part of the reason that we wanted to have you on the show is that I think to a person, everyone that I've talked to inside the Moet Hennessy universe, who's been a part of any of your trainings, always walks away blown away by them. They feel as though this is a thing that you do very consistently. And from the first time that I sat in one of your presentations, it was the thing that occurred to me right off the bat. You are able to take complex concepts, make them accessible, understanding, and you allow people to laugh at the situation in a really engaging way without making it comical. It's really cool. Essentially, so for those of you tuning in, Rich is responsible for, if you've ever met anybody from Moet Hennessy, the reason that they know what they're talking about is because they met Rich. They've sat through his training programs, and that's why they know what they're talking about. So that's essentially your job, is to make sure everybody at Moet Hennessy is on the same page and knows as much as possible about all these fascinating brands that are under the Moet umbrella. I just wanted to bring that up because I'm one of those people. I sat through your a champagne training of yours at the Moet office in Dallas, and I walked away feeling far less intimidated about champagne than I did before that meeting. So thank you for that.
Dan, that's very kind. It's very kind.
Well, yeah, it's well deserved. Another reason we want to have you on is your wine knowledge in general. Part of what we do at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg is that we use, a lot of the oak that we use is reclaimed from other purposes. When you hear that term, secondary maturation or wood finishing, it is the assumption that one can assume from that those casks, by the time we've gotten them, they've been used for other things, and we've selected them specifically because of the previous occupant of that cask. Cam, you've got some examples of some stuff that we use at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. I know, Rich, you do too. I pulled a Sauterne out of the back catalog. I've got a bottle of PX here as well that I'll throw up in front of the camera here in a bit. But one of the things that I wanted to lay out before we dig into the actual meat and potatoes of this conversation is why do secondary maturation on whiskey? If you're already using a cask that was used for something else, i.e. ex-bourbon oak, which makes up 90% of the cooperage in Scotland sitting full of whiskey right now. What is the difference between using an ex-bourbon oak cask to mature Scotch whiskey and you're using a cask that had previously held port or a sherry or Sauterne, or in the case of Glenmorangie Cake, Royal Tokaj, Hungarian dessert wine? Why do it? Well, in brief, you're using it because some of that previous occupant was sucked into the wood and stayed there. If you're using ex-bourbon oak, the liquid in that cask was at a high ABV. And so no matter, even though there was some of that product that was sucked into the wood, because it's a high concentration of ethanol, and ethanol is volatile, you're going to have almost a complete evaporation. So you're using ex-bourbon oak more for what the bourbon took out than what it left behind. The opposite is the case when you're using casks that held fortified wines, table wines, and so on, because those are low ABV products, and the residuals from those occupants are still embedded in the wood. So when you put your whiskey in, and in the case of Glenmorangie, it's typically already a mature whiskey that then sees a secondary maturation, sometimes at Ardbeg. It's from day one, but you're looking for the influence of that previous occupant. And so you've seen since 1987, you've seen a massive expansion of this concept. Now, Cam, you deal with whiskeys that don't often see a technical finishing or secondary maturation. We've talked about that a little bit in previous episodes, but if you'd care to elaborate on why that might be a shift in philosophy at Ardbeg versus Glenmorangie, please enlighten us.
Absolutely, yeah. Just a couple of things to touch on real quick there. Wonderful setup. First off, I guess I should say that let's double back and kind of discuss what finishing really is. So finishing is the act of taking an occupant that has come to an element of maturity in one style of cask, and then putting that into a secondary cask for X amount of months and or years. Generally, that time frame looks like about 2 months to about 2 years in terms of finishing. Secondary maturation would be anything past that 2 months. At Ardbeg, we practice whole components that are matured separately, quite simply because the phenolic rich and heavy styles of whiskeys that we really make, it's a little bit more difficult to turn that boat. It's like trying to turn a cruise liner versus trying to turn a speedboat. The whiskeys at Glenmorangie are just ever so slightly more responsive, and that's why finishing has been an element of that distillery since the mid '60s. I'd also really like to point out that when you're talking about different casks and especially finishing in secondary casks, not only is it important to recognize what the previous occupant was, but also the genetic makeup of that wood as well. Is it Quercus alba? Is it Quercus robur? Because not only is it important to discuss what the previous occupant either has to impart to the whiskey that you're creating, but also what that style of wood is also going to do to that whiskey as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing with Glenmorangie, especially, is you see that they have the very tall stills. They get that very light, elegant spirit, and to me that's where the extra maturation kind of comes into play. I mean, it really shows off the type of cask. Where I would, Cam, I guess you'd probably agree that like if it's Ardbeg, because we're dealing with a spirit that has a pretty big character already, that they approach the extra maturation in a different way, where Glenmorangie is all about it's really almost highlighting the type of cask, because that's such an elegant light spirit.
Absolutely, yeah, you're 100% right there. That's not to say that there aren't bottlings from Ardbeg where there's an element of finishing. I'm actually drinking one right now. Ardbeg Black, the committee release for this year. Some of that whiskey was actually finished. Going back to last year, Ardbeg Drum as well. Some of that whiskey is finished in rum cask. But for the core range at Ardbeg, it really is whole components that are aged separately before being brought together or assembled.
Before you deep dive too much on this conversation, I did want to say one little thing as a kind of backtrack to a quick little backstory for me. I was realizing when we talked, when you invited me for this session, that this idea of extra maturation, this is the reason I got into single malt Scotch. I had worked about 20 years ago on a project with Diageo's classic malts. And as a nice little gift, they gave me, a bunch of bottles. And that was my introduction to single malt Scotch. And I quickly, because I think the first bottle was probably Lagavulin. And I was like, oh my God. And I think I quickly kind of fell in love with, port finish. I dug up some other, producers that were doing port finish. And I do think this idea of extra maturation is, for people who maybe, I can't imagine people are watching this who aren't, Scotch fans, but if they're not Scotch fans, to me, it's a lovely entry. They're very welcoming. And I came from a wine side. That's where I started in this business. And so that, port finish, especially, it has some similar notes. You get the red fruits and you get a hint of color. So I love the fact that you guys invited me for this conversation because it's a topic near and dear to my heart and liver.
One in maybe a slightly more positive way than the other, but that's fantastic. And that's always sort of been my point as well. The idea that, Cam and I, we use this line quite a lot, that there's a whiskey for everybody. And I think when you look at how secondary maturation can shade a whiskey down a certain path towards a certain palate sensibility, it can really be a game changer for someone who isn't necessarily the biggest fan of straight up wood extractives. All of the things that you would normally associate with oak, toasted coconut and honey and vanilla, spiciness, those kinds of things, those are lovely. But if you were also looking for, as you'd mentioned, if you were also looking for dark fruits and dark cocoa and things like that, or in the case of, say, Nectar d'Or, a certain overripe, almost a syrupy note, or intense dried fruit characteristics, those things can, in a lot of different circumstances, come from the previous occupant of the cask that is then used to mature single malt Scotch. And Brendan, we were talking with him earlier, he made a really interesting point that we discussed a little bit, this idea that the previous occupant may have impacts that you either aren't considering or over considering or under considering. And he brought up the idea that the quality of the vintage of a wine, if you're using a wine cask, is a far more important concept, far more critical to the end product in terms of the whiskey matured in that cask than the mash bill of the whiskey that was in the cask before. If you were using an ex-bourbon oak cask and that cask happened to hold a bourbon that had a relatively high rye concentration in its mash bill, okay, is that going to be reflected in the end product on the Scotland side of things? Not a ton. But if you used a whatever it is, a Bordeaux cask, Burgundy cask, Portuguese red wine cask, and the vintage wasn't a particularly high quality vintage, that's going to have a fairly massive impact on the end product because of what we started talking about at the beginning. The amount of residual solids left embedded in the wood once that wine leaves the cask. If it's quality wine, it's going to have a quality impact on the whiskey. If it is not a quality wine, or if something happened with that particular vintage, then that's going to have a pretty gnarly effect at the end of the day. And that's an element that I just, until he brought that up, I hadn't considered it. I'm sure consumers are sitting around going, well, if it's a high rye content bourbon, why isn't that the same thing? It just isn't, because of what we talked about earlier. There's just way more evaporation of that product out of the cask once that cask has been disgorged. So Cameron brought up an interesting point about different species of oak. We deal with a number of different species, both at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. Rich, you are well versed not only in the whiskeys and other distilled spirits in the portfolio, but also the champagnes and still wines, sparkling wines and still wines. How do you How do you help the folks at Mount Hennessy understand the elemental differences between, say, American oak, French oak, other European oak varieties that might have discernible impact on the end liquid?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's an interesting question because I'm racking my mind right now thinking about where we use American oak other than bourbon and Scotch. So on the wine side, we see almost everything in French oak. And I think also on the wine side, because, my understanding is that the cooperages in the United States have figured out ways to produce American white oak in terms of cask that will, mimic kind of what is happening with the French oak. I mean, not exactly the same, but I've been told that they have some tricks they can do to almost mimic it.
Huh.
But to me, when we talk about oak, it is about the kind of magic of oak, and so the lucky thing is we don't have to deal too much, like I said, with American versus French for wine. There are flavor differences. You get, I think American oak, you can tend to get, I think, a bit more punchy flavors. You get a little bit more, like the flavors are a bit more obvious. The kind of the vanillin are a bit more obvious. Where the French oak, just because of the grains, everything, I think you get a little bit more of a subtle flavor and aroma. But I think about the technical aspect. How the great thing about it's oak maturation is, in a way, it helps almost kind of stabilize and clarify the wine. It kind of helps kind of marry all the components in the wine. It has the element of oxidation that kind of can soften some elements. We always joke that, oak will remove things that you don't like, and it will enhance things you do like. And there's that kind of magic aspect of oak maturation. And so that's usually what we talk about. It's interesting I'll just say one other thing kind of on this topic. It's interesting to see the history of American oak. So you see, of course, for wine, you do see it in North America and South America in certain areas. And you saw a lot of it in Spain, which I thought was interesting. And
Yeah.
I was like, years ago, one of my teachers was like, asked the class, he's like, why would Spain have a lot of American oak? And it wasn't because they liked the grain or they got even a good price on it or something like that. But it was the fact that they were, at one point in history, many times during history, they had a dispute with the French.
Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, that's so funny because you can actually see, the relationship even between like France and Scotland is developed because of the whole theory that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Taxation in whiskey in Scotland, has kind of ebbed and flowed. And one of the ebbings, I would say, would be at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, essentially the taxation on malted barley and on single malt Scotch whiskeys started to hike, and ultimately what you saw was that a really beautiful relationship between France and Scotland even started to form there because of that. That ideology that the enemy of my enemy really is my friend.
History's fun.
Well, and I had heard, I've heard on a number of occasions somebody tying the idea of deforestation in the UK and in Spain back to naval dominance at the expense of the ability to use those sorts of trees to mature wines and spirits in, which makes a certain amount of sense. And that's another one of those things. Thanks for bringing it up. It's another one of those things that people don't necessarily realize how much American oak ends up in Spanish sherry cooperage. Quite a lot of it, as it turns out. And actually, in researching this thing, I'd found out that there are specific South American oak varieties, as you'd mentioned, that end up in Spain as well that aren't Quercus alba. Then they're not Quercus robur. They're a different species of oak entirely that's native to South America. So this kind of UN of oak types certainly has at least something to do with what whiskey producers in Scotland deal with in terms of the cask stock coming in to the country. The next sort of topic that I thought we'd maybe clarify and talk a bit about, which is the thing that you, Rich, you talk a lot about in your still wine education courses, is grape tannins and the difference in concentration of grape tannin between red and white grape. Now, on the Scotch whiskey side of things, if it is an ex-bourbon oak, the likelihood is that it's Oloroso sherry. Sherry casks are going to have sherry in them, and sherry is predominantly made from a single Spanish white grape type called Palomino. So then when you switch from something like Glenmorangie La Santa to Glenmorangie Quinta Ruban, you're switching from a cask that had held, for all intents and purposes, a white wine to a cask that had held a red wine. So from your perspective, I mean, I think, drinkers can discern even just by looking, obviously, but by taste alone, a red wine and a white wine taste quite a lot different from each other, not just from the fruit perspective, but from the texture of them. How do you go about helping that make sense for people in terms of increased tannin presence in red wines?
Well, that's a good question. We usually start, very much from the basics, and people, I think, often wrestle with the idea of what tannins are, and you realize, oh, I know exactly what tannins are. I run into them in various aspects of food and drink, especially with tea. That's always the great example. I mean, because we do, of course, a lot of training about champagne. And champagne's a fun example because we have a white grape, we have a black grape. And not that Pinot Noir has a lot of tannins. Pinot Noir is a fairly thin-skinned grape. But it brings up the conversation of how do we make red wine and white wine? And the white wine is basically we get the skins out of the equation fairly quickly, and we're dealing just with the juice. And so for white wine, the majority of the time we don't have a tannic element at all. For the red wine, of course, the juice macerates with the skins to get the color, and we do get that tannins, and we do get that structure, that can be some astringency, that bitterness, that grippiness that you get in the palate. And I think usually it's the easiest way, of course, is just to have people taste between the two, and you do get like you said, that weight, that texture, that feeling on the palate of the tannins.
It's an interesting thing. I'm trying to think of. Oh, well, yeah, of course. I mean, if you're looking at across the portfolio, and this is where things start to get really interesting, I think, from Ardbeg's wood management program is, to me, fascinating because there's so many elements to it. And one of them, the substantive difference between what you end up with in a glass of Ugadal and what you end up with in a glass of Corey Brecken, those things are relatively similar ABVs. There you go.
That's why I pulled it down.
They're so far removed from each other in terms of, particularly, I think, mouthfeel, perceived dryness, grippiness on the palate. And I know we've talked about it in previous episodes, but can you just kind of walk us through how those two wood management regimens differ from each other in the production of Ugadal versus Corey Brecken?
Yeah, absolutely. That's always something that's kind of fascinated me, as well as something that I mentioned right at the very beginning was it's a little bit kind of like trying to turn a massive cruise liner when you're talking about Ardbeg's wood management program. So when we're constructing a whiskey like Ardbeg Ugadal, for example, obviously first, second fill, maybe a little bit of third fill ex-bourbon cask. Obviously, very different from how we utilize first and second fill ex-bourbon casks exclusively at Glenmorangie. It's one key difference right there, that Ardbeg doesn't necessarily shy away from using a little bit of third fill. But then also really the driving force behind that whiskey is going to be the sherry cask, the Oloroso sherry casks. Those sherry casks are going to give that whiskey this wonderful kind of nutty and very lipid, almost like fatty mouthfeel. I've always kind of said that Ugadal is for sure my favorite whiskey in the Ardbeg core range because of not only how it smells, how it tastes, but also how it feels when you engage with a dram of Ugadal. Corey of Reckon, you get to have a similar conversation, but from an opposite end of the spectrum, where Ugadal is, rich and almost decadent and lipid and fatty, curvaceous, if you would want to say that. Corey of Reckon is a little bit more angular, a little bit more pointed, and I think very representative of the fact that we're using virgin French oak going into that. We covered that with Jordan just a little bit last week as well. But the French oak aspect to Corey of Reckon really gives this whiskey an element of nuance and black pepper, eugenol, or like clove, like synthesized clove oil as well. So like it's spicy, it's rambunctious, two very differing styles of whiskey that could really only be created by taking the approach that Ardbeg does to its wood management program.
And Rich, you and I, well, actually, the three of us were talking about this before we went on. The idea that the somewhat still baffling, and I need to do more research on this, but the somewhat still baffling idea that French oak has quite a high concentration of tannins versus American oak. And tannins, by their nature, are more soluble in water than they are in ethanol. So why aren't all French wines tannic as hell? That's the thing because when we use ex-Sauternes barriques at Glenmorangie, you're looking obviously for the Sauternes, and here's a bottle of Sauternes. I'm going to switch over to this camera, and you can see it. So when we use Sauternes barriques, yes, then you can see the color of that stuff. It's a really pretty intense, and there's the brix weight is quite high for those grapes as they're being harvested. They're botrytized, so they've had a mold that's grown on them, and the water begins to leach out, and the residual sugar stays behind. So they're really sweet. They're really pretty ugly, but they make a pretty terrific wine. The trouble becomes you do want to capitalize on that. The residuals left behind in a Sauternes barrique, but you're looking to establish a balance between that and the fairly forward and obvious French tannin presence that can show up on the mouthfeel of things that are matured in French oak. I'm really baffled as to why, now that I'm thinking a little bit more deeply about this in terms of the primary occupant of a cask, why isn't all French oak just tannic as hell? Because those are the predominantly, and even here in the U.S., and tell me if I'm wrong here, in the U.S., loads of wine producers are using toasted French oak barriques for maturation. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. The thing, as you were talking about, the thing that kind of jumped out to me was thinking about the seasoning and doing proper outdoor seasoning for 3 years. Is that 36 months? Yeah, 3 years. Can't do my math right now. Because I know that will soften and mellow out those tannins quite a bit. And you would see a difference if you did the kiln drying, style of seasoning. It dries things out, makes things a lot harsher, but it's quicker and cheaper. But if you do the proper air seasoning, you get much more mellower tannins. The other thing, because when we first kind of spoke about this, it was about kind of how is the Sauternes cask different, and that the challenges with working with those casks. And I was thinking, if we look at sherry and ports, those are pretty awesome, barrels to use for this extra maturation because they tend to be quite old. So the tannins are pretty much gone. They have been soaked with their fortified wine for generations. In many cases, 40 or 50 year old barrels, and then you look at the size. right? I mean, port pipes are 600, I think, liters, something like that.
Yep.
The sherry butts are, I forget the
A
size of
little
those,
lower
but
than that, but not much.
yeah,
They're big.
yeah, exactly. So you're dealing with, and say for Glenmorangie, if we look at La Santa, Quinta Raban, Nectar d'Or, we're dealing with two scotches that are being extra matured in very large old casks, and you're getting the influence of that original material. Pretty, it's a very pure expression, if you will, of the sherry and the port. We come to Sauterne. Chateau Yquem, for instance, will they used to age their wines in new oak for 36 months, and they've dropped it down to 30 months. Probably doesn't make a huge difference for what we're talking about right now. But you're getting basically a 3-year-old barrel that held a low ABV in the grand scheme of things, 12, 14, somewhere around there. So of course, yeah, I think that's, these Sauterne casks or these kind of traditional wine casks would be quite a challenge. And right before we started this conversation, we were chatting about with Sauterne or Tokai, what does sugar do? And I don't know the answer to this. This is reaching the limits of my chemistry background. But what does that sugar do? If you're dealing with, 150, 200, think about with Tokai, even higher levels of sugar in some cases. What does that impact when we then take that spirit and put it into that cask? That to me is a very interesting question.
Yeah, agreed. And it'll be interesting to get, and I plan to get Brendan and Dr. Bill's take on that, because it feeds into a little bit broader discussion. It can, since we're both part of the sort of the whiskey goober industry. There's the conversation going currently about barrel entry strength, and wood sugars and fruit sugars are certainly structurally, from a chemistry point of view, structurally very similar, and water is going to be a better dissolver of sugar than alcohol is by a strong margin. So I'm posing the question that I need to get answered. If you're going in at a relatively high ABV, does the brix weight of the previous occupant matter as much as if you were going in at a low barrel entry strength? Is what we'd be doing on the Glenmorangie side of things. We'd be going into, and I think it was the same as, actually probably even a little bit lower for the cake, but let's just using Nectar as an example. You're going in at a barrel entry, going into the Sauterne barrel, the Sauterne Barrique at a barrel entry strength of around 58 ABV. So that's a relatively aggressive ABV, but there's still 42% water. So the ability to extract sugars not just from the wood, but also from the previous occupant, whatever the previous occupant left behind, is still certainly there. That's why I think, and Brendan mentioned earlier today, the research, the number of mistakes that are yet to be made in secondary maturation far outweighs what's been accomplished so far. And his point to me, to us as a group, was when people think that this subcategory of single malt Scotch whiskey maturation or single malt Scotch whiskey conceptualization is played out, we've only really scratched the surface of what's possible. Certainly the amount of experimentation that it will be happening both at Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, particularly at the Lighthouse at Glenmorangie, which will benefit both Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, will be extensive. And to Brendan's point, you still don't exactly know what's going to work. Nectar only happened because of the success of what became Pride 1981. He had no idea whether Sauterne Barriques were going to work. And it was the experiments with what became Pride 81 that convinced Dr. Bill that Nectar was a viable thing to add to the core range. Now, one of the things that we're dealing with now, and Rich, I don't know if you've gotten much background or insight into this, but in Portugal, the use of traditional pipes is decreasing, where at the same time, the use of toasted French oak barriques is on the increase. So that's changed how we have to deal with Quinta Ruban as well. Is now we've got an interface that's got more tannin potential than it used to. So the newer barrels, they haven't been around the bodegas long enough to become knackered or to have their componentry exhausted. So that's one of those things that one of the reasons that you saw the change in Glenmorangie age statement was because of that, because the increasing number of Ruby Port barriques that we're using or that we're receiving from Portugal is on the increase. And that, because of the tannin perspective, it changes things. And because, and to your point, because of the change in wood to liquid ratio, it becomes a big management puzzle.
Yeah,
that we're constantly working our way through.
that's a huge wrench being thrown into the plan there. If I was Brendan or Dr. Bill, and suddenly, my Ruby Port casks were nice big port pipes, and now they're sending me whatever 250 or 225 liter French barriques especially for Ruby Port, because that's got to be an interesting, if they are making Ruby Port with French barriques, that's got to be a pretty interesting port too. I mean, that Ruby Port on a good day is very vibrant and bright and punchy. So it must be jumping out of the glass with French oak, especially if they're using any sort of new French oak.
Energetic.
Right.
Energetic, but God, if I was in their position and suddenly someone switched up my port cask, that would be pretty frustrating.
Well, exactly. And it can be. I mean, because of what happened with Ardbeg Black, that's coming from Pinot Noir cask, and those would be French oak. Mm-hmm. It's the parallel that you'd made there is a really compelling one. It's that the fruitiness is obvious.
Yeah.
But that French oak presence is certainly there, particularly in the committee version. But it's a lane changer for what Ardbeg would normally be. That of course the beating heart of Ardbeg is the 10-year, and there is no French oak influence there. But it's fascinating to me to taste and watch and see and feel the effect of French oak on the various Ardbeg products that it influences. Really, really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that's why I've got both Black and Corey of Reckon down in front of me today, is because the organoleptic presence of these tannins is again, it's a treat not only for how things taste and smell, but also how they feel on your palate as well. So for Ardbeg Black, there is this like wicking, kind of like under-ripened strawberry aspect to the whiskey that I've absolutely kind of fallen in love with. And for Corey of Reckon, I kind of mentioned that it very much so is that that lime skin, apple peel, as well as some beautiful kind of like cinnamon, and again that very much so angular and kind of taut aspect to the whiskey.
I mean, I think one other thing we can talk about the extra maturation is the color. And you just mentioned Ardbeg Black, and I've got Quinta here, and it's like, especially let's just talk about the Ardbeg Black, because you put that in a glass next to, Corey of Reckon and Ugadal and Tin and Wee Beastie and whatever, and it is so obvious. It is just so obvious, and they don't do any sort of caramel color correction at Ardbeg, so you get this. I mean, it's like the baby Ardbeg. It's the rosé, if you will. Not in flavor, but at least in color. And to me, I love that. If I was talking to, if I was doing some sort of event or dinner, I would totally be pointing out that look at the color on this. We're finishing this in red wine cask, and if you want proof, it's right there in your glass, which is I think is kind of cool. One little element we can't forget is the color.
Yeah.
And to a degree, your statement at the top of the hour of how these types of whiskey can open new doors for consumers to enter the category in ways that they're already somewhat familiar with. You may not necessarily be a specific port drinker, but you're familiar with red wine, familiar with the overarching characteristics of red wine. And so if you get into not just Quinta Ruban, but if you get into some of the some of the other single malts that see that same sort of finish work, Cragganmore Distillers Edition and Balvenie 21 Portwood, you're going to run into the same dark fruits and dark cocoa characteristics that take single malt from one place and plant it firmly in a different place that's closer to your palate's point of references.
Exactly.
So, which reminds me, one of the things that I think is really fascinating about what we're seeing in terms of secondary maturation is not just a branching out in terms of the wood sources that are being utilized in Scotch whiskey, and Glenfiddich Grand Cru jumps to mind, and its use of its use of champagne, ex-champagne cask, but also the number of distilleries here in the U.S. that are starting to utilize, and it's a little bit more difficult in terms of legally, what you can do legally and how you have to label it, and all the things that go along with U.S. bourbon law in order to make that clear to the consumer. But you're starting to see secondary maturation seep into other global whiskey categories. Certainly, I think it's absolutely fascinating. It's happening with Cavalon has been doing it in Taiwan for a while now. Certainly, you're seeing. I think the biggest example, the most obvious example of a secondary matured American whiskey is probably Angel's Envy, that sees its finish in ruby port as well.
Or rum cask. They got rum cask as well.
Oh yeah, big time. And that's.
I have friends at Woodinville have port finish, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Certainly. And so that's a really good point. Now you're talking about using secondary maturation casks that had spirits in them and not necessarily low ABV wines, fortified wines, and so on and so forth. That enters into, obviously, and we were talking about how sugars render themselves in secondary maturation. If you're looking at a really big, dark, gnarly Guatemalan rum versus some silver rum, that's going to have a massive impact in terms of the difference that it makes when a whiskey has spent time in different types of rum cask. Next week we will have a rum distiller on the show, and she'll be talking mostly about stills and still construction and how that differs, the utilization of stills between the rum industry and the whiskey industry. But one of the things I'd like to chat with her about is this idea, the secondary maturation idea, using rum cask to mature whiskeys. That'll be loads of fun. Those of you watching this next week and the week after, there'll be 2 shows in a row where we'll be talking about stills, and our guests for those shows will be some pretty terrific folks. So please tune in for that. It'll be loads of laughs to try to walk through. We preemptively made it 2 shows because we just knew there'd be so much geeky minutia to talk about in terms of stills and their usages in the whiskey industry and beyond.
Let me just
virtual bookmark.
Yeah,
I was going to add one quick thing, because
Exactly.
you're talking about the finishing in a rum cask versus a wine cask, and I guess also the thing to kind of distill what we've talked about is
nicely done.
I mean, the relationship between ABV, so higher ABV will extract more tannins, right? And so that.
Right? I think that's the subject of some debate because tannins are more soluble in water than they are in alcohol. And this is general, all plant tannins together, all tannin sources combined. That's the general rule. But wood tannins, it may be behaviorally a different thing, and I don't know that. It's another one of those. And I'm gonna put a stringer on my finger and look that up. Supporting
cast of organic compounds may be more soluble in ethanol than in water, but to Dan's point,
Yeah, that's just tannin specifically.
Okay.
When you've got those, Cam, that's a really good point. You've got those hallmarks, the surrounding cast of characters. So tannin has an astringency, and Rich put it really well. If you are drinking a strong tea, or if you have an aspirin and you just let it dissolve in the middle of your, it's the stuff that makes your tongue want to stick to the roof of your mouth. Drying, astringent, makes your gums tingle a little bit. That's a thing. But the flavor compounds around that remind your palate that you've experienced that before in specific ways, those things, the relative solubility level of those things in alcohol and water, I think that's where the real difference is. And tannin concentration doesn't have to be super high to have a strong, discernible effect on the palate as well. And with all these things, that everything that isn't ethanol and isn't water makes up a very small percentage of what's in the bottle anyway.
Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, to bring it back kind of full circle, we started the top of the hour talking about Nectador, and saying, well, why isn't Nectador, incredibly tannic, but there is this spice element to that whiskey. I do think that that can be attributed to, the fairly aggressive barrel entry strength at 58, or 50, 58, 59. I can't remember specifically, Dan. But then also the solubility of those supporting cast members in ethanol, which is going to be fairly present due to the high barrel entry strength.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. That's gonna. And I think to Brendan's point, you just don't know until you try it, until you break a billion eggs, and some of them, maybe a lot of them, don't fly. Of course, none of that stuff would end up in the inside of a bottle that says Glenmorangie or Ardbeg on it. Everything that works, every bottle of something that works, whether it's experimental or whether it's part of our core range, is the offspring of many, many, many trials and errors. Mm-hmm. I think that's part of we mentioned what Brendan had mentioned to us earlier in the day, was that the experimentation has basically just begun, and there's so many mistakes yet to be made, and the consumer is going to be the beneficiary of that research and development, and the mistakes that are going to invariably be made, so that we have a better sense of the things that do work and the things that don't, which I'm thoroughly looking forward to. Every one of these experimental releases that comes out of Glenmorangie is another example of, hey, that actually worked. Sweet, it worked out really well. But there may be 9 or 10, that led to that. There's no way to know, because we would never bottle it.
To me, I think my takeaway from this conversation is what you just said. Kind of what Brendan is saying. This is still a very young, study, if you will, and you think about. I mean, every little factoid that we can kind of come up with, you can find exceptions, I think, to that rule. And so it's not just about size of the cask. It's not just is it American or French. It's not just is it new oak or old oak. There's so many little factors. And so if I had to summarize this conversation, I would just say it's complicated, right?
No.
Yep.
No, to your point, I mean, secondary maturation and finishing has really only been around since the mid '60s. So I mean that leaves a whole lot of real estate to be discovered. But I do think that is one of the things that makes Scotch whiskey, in my opinion, the most interesting whiskey category. Is that the propensity for innovation is so incredibly high. Whereas, just now over the last 5 years have we started to discuss those things in American-made whiskeys. But that sense of exploration in a whiskey sense has been part of Scotch whiskey's kind of dynamic since the mid '60s.
And when you look at the influence that a barrel has in a barrel-aged spirit, particularly in a whiskey, in a dedicated whiskey that's beyond just sort of 10 minutes in oak or a year and a half or whatever, when oak becomes part of the narrative, it becomes most of the narrative. Not necessarily just because of the extractives, but if we rattle off that 65-70% of the flavor profile of single malt Scotch whiskey is derived from the barrel. Yeah. Of course, that depends on the whiskey, but that's a huge number. Even if it was 50,
Yeah.
you'd still have to treat that barrel as that barrel, the provenance of that barrel, your barrel choices, and the array of possible choices that you have in front of you, as critical to realizing the distiller's vision in order to produce the whiskey that they set out to produce and put in the bottle, because it's such an influential part of the equation. And this idea, to Cam's point, this idea of shadings, subtle shadings of secondary cask types. It's a relatively new concept. It's not that those casks weren't ever used before, but the conscious decision to use them for the characteristics that they brought to the end product, that's a relatively new concept. And it's easy to look at it and go, okay, well, when distillers run out of cask types to use, then they're out of ideas, and then you start seeing, the popcorn schnapsing of the Scotch whiskey industry. And I don't really see where that's a problem, because for each cask type that you're talking about, then you have how much time, where is it stored, is it on his side, is it palletized, how many uses did the previous occupant get? I mean, is it 2, 3, 4 vintages of Sauterne that sit in that cask before we get it? Is it one? All of there's so much that goes into how that cask was treated before you got your hands on it, and then what you do with it. Milshin's a good example of what do you do with it after. Do you, or Grooves, another good example of what do you do with that cask once you get it? You don't just have to accept it and take the bung up, put the whiskey in, and call it a day. It's all kinds of stuff that you can do with it post that. And Jim Swan was a huge part of rethinking what the inside of a cask, a reclaimed cask, should be and could do for you. To his point, to his point, we're just getting started with guys like Bill and Brennan at the helm of whiskey distilleries like Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. There's no telling what the future holds. There's no telling what they'll get up to. They're both madmen. They're both willing to try lots and lots and lots of stuff. They're just not willing to put anything that isn't fantastic in a bottle. So at the end of the day, the consumer sort of wins.
Something that I think is incredibly interesting as well is now, after sipping a little bit of Corrievrecken and a little bit of Ardbeg Black throughout the hour, returning to Ardbeg 10, I'm just like, Jesus Christ, this whiskey is just still so good to me. Still so good to me. Yeah.
Yep. It feels to me a bit like Ardbeg 10 to me feels a little bit like the more exposed the base spirit in the cocktail, the better the spirit's got to be. Or like a really good piece of fish or whatever. It's got to be damn good. And once you're at that level, you don't necessarily have to do a lot to it. You just don't want to necessarily get in the way of its greatness, which is not to say that all of the other barrel experiments are not worth doing, or that they're hiding substandard whiskey. That's certainly not the case. It's just shadings in different directions, and the sort of the manifestations of the curious minds of the whiskey creation team at work using the tools that make up the palette of decisions that they make every day and try to make really, really fantastic whiskeys. I just want to rattle through and see if we've got any questions that we haven't already answered in the comments. Wyatt approves of your outfit, Cam. Good for you. That is awesome. Rich, there's a question for you. If you're not careful and you start flailing, will you knock the thing behind you down? It looks.
It's a bookshelf. Safe. It's a. I think they call it the spine bookshelf.
Oh, those are cool. Yeah. I like that you've loaded it at least with some wine and spirits, as opposed to just books.
Yes,
great.
Which is terrific. Let me see. Great, Donna. Thanks for joining us. Here's another point from Catherine. This is Cam. That was a good point that you made in terms of the mouthfeel differences of Corrievrecken. Sometimes that stuff it may float past the consumer in terms of it's different. Why is it different? And something as conceptually simple but as complicated as a decision regarding the use of not just French oak but new toasted French oak for full maturation as a component of Corrievrecken makes a huge amount of difference. So that was fun. Rich, we're going to have you on again at some point because you're just a blast to hang out with. Any other points that you guys want to make in terms of the prevailing conversation regarding secondary maturation?
Yeah, I'll just repeat what I said at the beginning because I love this category of whiskey, and to me it is a great entry, especially for those of us who maybe came from the wine side. And I love the little being able to hear Brendan talk about this earlier before the show about how I don't know like Cam, you just said like we only started doing this like in the 60s. That does seem like a long time ago, but you're right. In the grand scheme of things, this is a fairly new process and technique. And I kind of love the fact that, no one has nailed it down. That we're in the infancy of this idea of extra maturation in Scotch whiskey. So what a cool time to be drinking Scotch.
Truly.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks, guys. That was loads of fun. Let's see, what's everybody doing? So, Cam, you've got your show. You've got Whiskey Through Food on Mondays and Fridays. That's gone to a Facebook and YouTube live stream, right, at 5:00 Eastern on Monday and Friday. You'll find that at Ardbeg Cam. Golly, well, you'd have to look at right Cameron George on Facebook. And then you've got a YouTube channel that's devoted to Whiskey Through Food. Is that right?
So
or is that your YouTube channel?
It now has two. It has a YouTube channel, which is called Ardbeg Cam, where we go live every Monday, every Friday, and then there's also a Facebook page dedicated to Ardbeg Cam as well, which also is a great spot to view the Whiskey Through Food. Again, 5:00 Eastern Standard Time every Monday, every Friday.
Very cool. And Rich is busy basically reinventing the universe of Moet Hennessy internal education via the creation of Engage MH, which we're all blown away by the capacity of that thing and the long-term vision that you've brought to the equation. I think everybody who's got access to it, which is essentially Moet internal and the distributor network, is just eternally grateful for what you've been able to do there. You guys both have pets. Mine's asleep. I should probably put camera to her because she's just been crashed out the whole time. But you're Happy Robot USA on Instagram. You take fantastic photos. You were just staying recently at the TWA Hotel.
TWA. So I think
it looks cool.
Yeah, my Instagram is mainly travel, which is kind of not happening right now, and cocktails and my orange cat. That's basically the feed. So that's at Happy Robot USA. And then our little education team, the brand education team at Moet Hennessy, responsible for training like 4,000 people is huge. We're 3 people. We covered North America. So awesome. And we also have kind of an education presence on Instagram at engage.mh. So engage.Moet Hennessy, engage MH.
And that's open to anybody.
That's
right?
open to anybody. That's
fantastic.
There you go. But you'll find me at Happy Robot USA.
Perfect. And at engage.mh. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Very cool. On Instagram. I'm Glenn Modan on Instagram and the Glenn Modan YouTube channel. You'll see this Highlands to Islands on the Highlands to Islands YouTube channel, which if you go to the Instagram presence for Highlands to Islands, at Highlands_TO_islands, you'll see the link in bio to that YouTube channel where you'll see an archived recording of this and all the other episodes of Highlands to Islands. You'll see us here every Tuesday on Facebook and YouTube Live at 2 p.m. Eastern, talking about all kinds of stuff. We'll be talking to some really compelling folks moving forward, as well as we have today with Rich. So please tune in. Don't miss Cam's live show on Monday and Fridays, and please check us out here again every Tuesday at Highlands to Islands. Thanks, guys. That was a blast. Thanks, Rich, for taking the time. Cam, as always, it's a pleasure sharing screen time with you, and we'll do it again next week.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.